Hey guys, it's Ashley. I hope quarantine life is treating you well. I hope you're not going too stir crazy. I can't believe that we are a quarter of the way through the journey. That is crazy to me. Today's reading is the book of Ruth, and it's one of the shorter books in the Bible. It's only 4 chapters, and it's one of my favorite stories, mainly because it shows God's sovereignty, and because it provides some really practical, like how to live your life lessons in it. So we're going to talk about that today. So if you've been following along with us in the journey, we are at Ruth today. If you haven't been following along with us, or if you've missed a couple days, just pick back up with us today with a great story in the book of Ruth. So one of my favorite attributes of God is his sovereignty. He has the right, the power, and the authority over everything. And we see that characteristic of God throughout the book of Ruth. I mean, it's no accident that Ruth goes to get wheat from Boaz's field of all the fields around. It's no accident that the closest relative to Ruth actually declined marriage, leading her to be able to marry Boaz. We see that God had a purpose and a plan throughout the whole story. But like I said, we can see God's sovereignty in the story, but we also get some practical, good life as a believer and as a follower of God in this story too. So I wanted to dive in and take a look at 3 characteristics of Ruth's life, 3 things that Ruth did that I think are important for us to follow too. So let me paint the scene for you. Ruth had been married for 10 years before her husband died, and they didn't have any kids. And if you've been keeping along with us in the journey, you know that that's kind of a big deal. For a woman to not have a husband and to not have children meant she probably had a really hard time. A husband meant that she was going to be provided for and protected, and children meant that she had a source of security and care, and Ruth no longer had a husband and didn't have the hope of children at that point. So when her husband died, her mother-in-law Naomi says, go to your homeland, go back, find a new husband, just go. And the natural response would have been to go home, to find a new husband, to have children. But Ruth chose to cling to Naomi, despite knowing how difficult it would be. Choosing to stay with her meant that Ruth was making a big sacrifice. She was sacrificing the opportunity for another spouse, the safety and comfort of being back in her homeland of Moab, and she was sacrificing just the security and love of a family. And let's be real, Naomi was probably not super fun to be around at the time. I mean, she literally changed her name to Bitter. And I don't know about you, but I don't really want to hang out with someone who calls themselves Bitter. But Ruth chose to stay with her. And that choice probably didn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people. But Ruth made that sacrifice and that choice anyways. We also see that Ruth is super faithful to that commitment. It's crazy. Ruth chose to remain faithful to that commitment each day, and that was probably really hard. She did a lot of manual labor for Naomi. She lived as a foreigner in the land of Israel, and Moabites were not necessarily Israelites' favorite people. She dealt daily with Naomi's poor attitude, and she could have easily avoided this all by just going home to Moab and pursuing her dreams of marriage and having children, but she didn't. She remained faithful to that sacrifice and that commitment that she made, despite the fact that her goals and her dreams were probably unmet and lost. And a lot of times when we face goals and dreams and ideas and plans that don't happen or don't happen the way we think they should, we can lose hope. But we don't see any sign of hopelessness in Ruth's life. In fact, we never read about her looking back, regretting her choice, or falling into self-pity. Instead, we see Ruth profess love and faith in the God of Israel, and making him her God and finding her hope in him. So Ruth's life, I think, is characterized by her sacrifice, her faithfulness, and her hope in the Lord. So yeah, basically the book of Ruth ultimately is a story about God's sovereignty and providing a redeemer. Ultimately it points to our redeemer in Christ. So just as Boaz was Ruth's kinsman redeemer, who could redeem the devastation in her life, God provides us with Christ the Redeemer, who redeems us from our own devastation, our own sin. He provides a way for us to have a relationship with God. Again, despite our sin and shame, He redeems that. He restores us completely. So my hope, my prayer is that we would grow to be more like Ruth, that we would live sacrificially, that we would be faithful to our word, and that ultimately we would place our hope in the Lord, the God who provided us with that ultimate Redeemer in Christ. So as we wrap up, I've just got a couple questions I'd love for you to pray through and think about as we're thinking and meditating on the book of Ruth. The first question just is, what is God calling you to sacrifice or surrender today? Maybe you're facing a tough choice about college. Maybe you're facing decisions about who to date or if to date. Or maybe you're faced with a tough choice of having to distance yourself from some bad influences. It could be anything. But the Lord could be calling you to make a sacrifice for Him today. And so I just encourage you to pray about that. And that choice that you make might seem extreme to some people. Ruth's choice definitely did, but it was worth it. We see the Lord just be so faithful to her. And then the second question kind of goes along with that, but how are you going to remain faithful? How are you going to keep your word regarding what God is calling you to sacrifice or surrender to Him? Maybe you are going to remain accountable to a person. Maybe tell a close friend and ask them to help keep you on track, keep you accountable. Maybe you commit to praying for a couple of minutes every day, specifically about that choice. It could be anything, but I think it's really important if you know that the Lord is calling you to make a sacrifice or just surrender something to Him, that you have an action plan, that you don't just say, oh, I know God's calling me to do this. You say, no, this is how I'm going to follow through with that. And then the last question I have is probably the most important. I just want to ask what your hope is in. Is it in Christ? Is it in something else? Maybe you've put your hope into a relationship or a friendship. Maybe your hope is in your own abilities. I just encourage you to take some time today to assess where you're at with this. Ask the Lord to show you that He's the only thing worth putting your hope in. So that's kind of what I have for the book of Ruth. I hope the Lord uses a couple seconds of that to encourage you today. And I hope you find some awesome ways to just honor Him and glorify Him in this crazy pandemic time. I'll see you later.